we'll let you explore that.
Uh, how many people are going to be here today, do you think?
I imagine a pretty good number. We'll see. There's already 160.
Oh my.
So I'm just making sure it's popping in everywhere.
Fantastic.
See, there we go.
Frozen in Nashville. Oh my.
Yeah, I'd love it if people put in there where they're from and stuff.
Yeah.
I recognize Don. Don's in my cottage group too.
Oh.
He is a active in the live conversation part of classes. You know, some people, because of when you get classes that are homebrew related, so many people are used to listening to podcasts, they just download them, and it's kind of like they'll listen like it was another podcast episode, just even more nerdy. But then there are people like Don who join live. He always is asking good questions.
Yeah. And also, I see Carolyn in there from Ashland, Oregon. She's the same way over at the cottage too. Both Don and Carolyn respond to tons of stuff and put in great comments and always ask really good questions. Recognize a few other names too. Great.
Yeah, I do too.
Oh yeah. Yeah, so this is going to be this will be fun. Snow Camp, North Carolina. Exciting.
Oh, did it snow down there today?
No, that's the name of the town is
Oh.
Snow Camp.
Yeah. It has snowed there before, Diana.
Well, it has snowed here too in Washington, D.C. in the past, but the last 2 years, not so much.
I know. Same here.
Oh yeah. So everyone that is hopping on, just to give you a few boring things before we jump right in, so I don't have to explain it during it. But I know there are people joining in from Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and YouTube. All of you, any of your comments and such will come here, and I can always throw them up on the screen, not just to let people know they're hanging out with people all over, but like the Netherlands. Oh, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But also, if you have questions that come up in the first half and such, put them in. But just type question in all caps, then put your question, and I can save them until we get to the Q&A time. So that's always good. The other thing before we go is this session is going to be quite a bit of fun, because I have been trying to arrange schedules for Diana and Bill to be on at the same time for, I don't know, a significant period of time. And so the origin story of this particular topic, welcome to the post-Christian century, I'll give it to you, and then we'll dig in, is Diana and I've had this ongoing phone call / text exchange / Twitter DM. I actually think there should be an app where your good friends, all your messages from every app go to one place, so I remember where they are. But we've been talking about in advance, like, what do we want to do this Lent? And the challenge or crisis of the moment that's kind of stuck in both our crawls is we're at this place where we are more and more aware of the dignities and disasters of our history, both as a nation and as people of faith, the blessings that we've inherited, but also the curses. And what do we do? And when thinking about what we do with our inheritance well and what we hand on is a challenge. We all know there are monuments that we need to take down, that there are altars where our nationalism may have occupied the altar where the cross was, or our militarism or racism and sexism and patriarchy. All these things we know we have to wrestle with. But then what is the history that's there? There's this big energy of cynicism alive, especially in more progressive people, as to what we do with our institutions, religious, political, cultural. And that deterioration of the social structure is going on, and we recognize it as a problem, but we can't be naive to reclaim the past with the naivete that we've worked so hard to overcome. And so in that going back and forth, Diana texts me the idea of empty altars after a really cool story I'm sure she'll tell at some point. And I'm like, oh, that's so good. Let me see if the URL is available. And it is emptyaltars.com. So that all began, and I said, yeah, what is our challenge? What do we got to introduce people to even how you as a historian is thinking about the post-Christian century. And that sounds fun, Tripp. I said, you know how I've been wanting to hang out with you and Bill Leonard at the same time? And then I started texting and emailing, and this is the church historian blind date of fun. Bill not only wrote the Homebrew Guide to Church History and is an American church historian, leading Baptist historian, a wonderful public scholar, but any of the good things I ever mentioned from church history are a part of him being my church history professor. So as you can imagine, I've had running imaginary conversations with both of them in my head for years, sometimes vivid dreams. But nonetheless, anyway, I'm super excited about this. Anyone that's interested that wants to come hang out with us over Lent, they can go check out emptyaltars.com. But the setup today, when I had talked with Diana and Bill, is I was like, how about each of you give a little 5-minute nugget of how you're framing the post-Christian century. And then I have a list of topics from my imagination and or a couple vivid dreams. So yeah. One other thing I thought would be important is Bill, and I will link to this when we post this. Bill does regular columns that give that church historian perspective, and on the Global Baptist News feed. So if you enjoy high quality writing like Diana's for The Cottage, where you see what a church historian brings, I'll definitely link it there so you can see what Bill's up to. So with that, I'm going to let did we say Diana was going to talk first? Yes. Excellent. Awesome.
Okay. It is good to be here and to talk about this subject. I kept kind of putting you off, Tripp. I don't know if you remember when you first brought it up, post-Christian century. I thought it was, I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to talk about it. So I've been thinking about it since we started throwing it around. And I remembered something just this morning that I haven't thought of for a really long time. And that is back in the late 90s, right around the turn of the millennium, I was in Memphis teaching at Rhodes College. And while I was there, I was being interviewed for another job. And that other job was here in Washington, D.C., where I eventually moved, although I didn't get the job, to be a content producer with Religion and Ethics News Weekly, that show that was on PBS. Yeah. And so I remember teaching my class at Rhodes. We were looking at religious trends and sort of what the future of Christianity was going to be like in the new millennium. And then I flew to DC to do this job interview. And one of the people who was in the job interview was the great Bob Abernathy, of course. He was amazing and wonderful. Passed away, I guess, about 2 years ago now. But another fellow was a producer of the show. I do not remember his last name. His first name was Arnie, and he was Jewish. He's probably still alive. But we were, talking about content. And Arnie asked me the question, what do you see coming down the road? What do you think is the future of American religion? And I said, well, clearly the next century will be marked by a shift toward a post-Christian America. And in that conversation, he looked at me and he laughed out loud. And he said, look, I'm a Jew, and I got to tell you, there is no post-Christian anything in America, and there is never going to be. This is just a nation that's shaped by Christianity. You got any better ideas? And I just sat there and I was so deflated. I mean, I was barely 40. I was sort of, in this really interesting moment of my own career change. I was trying to, run out this big idea, and lo and behold, it just completely got shut down. And I remember leaving that interview and trying to sort of explain in my own mind what I had meant by that. And had I gotten a second chance, I think I would have talked to him more about it. Doesn't mean that there's not going to be a lot of Christians in America, but there is some way that is coming in which Christianity is going to be moving toward a back burner, that it will not be as institutionally powerful. It will not have the same kind of public voice. I could imagine that there were going to be big divides because of the tensions and problems that were being created by the religious right and the decline of the main lines. And so there were all kinds of hints and possibilities that were sort of laying around us in the culture about a quarter of a century ago, where if people were paying attention, we might have noticed that this moment that we are in now would eventually come. And I've sort of wondered, if we were to go out to lunch and have that conversation again, I wonder what he would say between then and now. Would he say, "Oh yeah, now I get it. Boy, that's a great idea. We should do an entire series on what a post-Christian America would look like." But 20 years ago, it was a hard sell. And now I think less so. So I just wanted to tell a story because we've been living in the shadows of this emerging shift for quite a number of decades. And sometimes shadows become reality, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes history takes an unexpected turn, and things that you anticipate don't happen. But in this case, those people who were saying that we were moving toward a post-Christian society 20 or 30 years ago, those people were right. And that history did not take a change and move in a different direction. As a matter of fact, I think that the shift toward a post-Christian America has been faster, more complete, and more full of anxiety and tensions than what even the most glum of prophets imagined 2 decades ago.
Awesome. Thank you, Diana. All right, Bill, how would you like to frame going into this conversation?
Diana has really given a great place to start in kind of tracking that evolution. I would start by using some phrases I've used over the years to describe it and these changes. And I think I want to start by simply saying, in this conversation about post-Christian America, let's not start by blaming secularism. I see a lot of people, I don't know why, I remember William Barr, and I think one of the Supreme Court judges gave lectures at Notre Dame. Everybody wants to go to Notre Dame and blast secularism, I think. But they tried to do that and blaming the secularization of America for the way in which Christianity is struggling right now in so many areas. There's room to blame secularism, but let's not start with that. As people inside the Christian movement, let's not start with that until we get to ourselves. And let's also talk about the society. And here are some phrases I would use. Let's just say roughly by the beginning of this new century, we really came upon a permanent transition in American life. By that, I mean the old ways of being Christian, the old ways of defining the nature of faith, and the rituals that were so ingrained in so many of us who grew up in that strong, relatively strong denominational tradition. Those are all have been and are up for grabs. And you can't say, well, when is it going to settle down? When is it going to be somewhat stable? The permanent transition is with us for God knows how long. That's number one, at almost every level and across the theological and certainly the denominational spectrum. The second thing that has just become a major mantra for me is the changing sociology of Sunday. The changing sociology of Sunday. And by that I mean Sunday as a Christian day of privilege, a privileged Christian day, has been eroding for some time. And by that, people ask me when I talk about this in churches, what do you mean by the changing sociology of Sunday? And I say, I'll give you a one-word definition: soccer. And everybody nods their head in the audience, because they know about children and grandchildren who, if they get to church, sit in the back of the church and leave early because that's when the soccer game starts, and they have to be there to play. And this changing sociology of Sunday also means that Sunday carries with it much more baggage, or a collective baggage, than it used to. It's a day that some people work. It's a day of sports events. I could have said, in Charlotte, football games on Sunday, but it's football games. It's visiting aging parents. It's having kids in college. It's a whole collection of things, so that statistically, I think there was a study a while back that said even the people who are most regular in churches may only attend 40% of the time, because of the other demands of Sunday that they get. So I think making that point, and then of course we're all stretched to the point of obsession with the nuns, or the nons. I prefer to say non, because NUN could be confusing as well. And that's one of the radical sociological signs of this, that I think for evangelical, for certainly for mainline, and I think for many evangelical denominations, the decline in membership and participation really started in the late 20th century. But by the 21st century, it just took off. And where Gallup had 7 to 8% of persons in surveys that identified themselves as non, meaning having no discernible religious affiliation, that was a kind of solid figure for years. And then it started inching up with the turn of the century. And now most estimates are that it's right around 30% of the population, and even larger for millennials. 1 in 5 generally, and 1 in 3 millennials or so. And all of those are signs. And then one other thing, and I speak about this particularly because evangelicals and the whole evangelical shtick has been so much a part of the press. And that is, let's just be specific about evangelicals. The evangelical way of defining and describing the gospel and calling persons to conversion, which is one of the 4 hallmarks of evangelicalism, David Bevington's list. And they just began to shut down. And the ways of the mass revival crusades of Billy Graham and others, and even in many, a lot of evangelical churches, the decline of revivals as a means of awakening the populace. And those declines, particularly when one more quick controversy developing within that post-Christianization, has come for many Christian groups, particularly evangelicals, the rise of fundamentalism and the fundamentalization of American religious nature. And I think part of that should be expected because of, and I'll use this strong word, something of the panic that set in when evangelicals found that a growing number of persons were not responding to "Just as I Am" every time you sang the song. I'll quit at that.
Well, that's awesome. So I feel like 7 of the 15 topics I wanted to hear y'all talk about, you've already like given a little teasers for. And don't worry, anyone on the stream, we won't start playing Just As I Am at the end. But I'm interested as church historians. One of the things about this moment is you start to see a number of these little features show up in your congregation, or you could show up in pop culture, show up in the news. You start to see these things. And given the way we respond when our identity is attached to an institution, religious, political, or whatever, these shifts of change can actually make it feel overwhelming, and we get hopeless rather quickly. And one of the gifts, I think, being friends with the history of the church gives is a different kind of perspective. And so I would be interested in hearing you each share a bit about how a more thorough awareness and familiarity with church history reframes the kind of anxiety it's easy to have if you're just tracking, right, the rise of the nuns or participation rates or the change of Sunday or, this came a lot faster than even religious leaders had, like with Diana's story 20 years ago. So what's the perspective shift or places in the past that you look to help us, jump past the immediate anxious demands, but look at the present in kind of a historical grounding?
I can give a really good immediate one that relates to one of the points that Bill brought up. He talks about, and I like that, Bill, talking about them as the non-religious rather than the nuns. I'd never heard that, so it's in here now. Where 25 to 30% of the population now is in that category. Part of the argument I was making to Arnie 20 years ago, I did eventually make in a blog for the old God's Politics blog at Sojourners. Sometime 2003, 2004. I'm not exactly sure when. I want to go back and find it. But I wrote a piece about how bad religion, and we were seeing a lot of bad religion in support of the Iraq War, a lot of bad religion that was leading to bigotry against Muslims. Think about how much bad evangelicalism there was at the turn of the 21st century that was present in our public life. And, the Bush administration just using religion willy-nilly to back all kinds of ideas and crusades, literally crusades, that seemed dangerous at the time and were dangerous in looking back. So anyway, I wrote this piece about how bad religion won't cure people, won't make people inoculate against bad religion. If religion is bad, it doesn't drive people into good religion. What it usually does is it drives people away from religion.
Yes.
And I used as my example what happened in Europe after the wars of religion in the 17th century. And you get all of these years of division and warfare, of people conflating theological identities with particular kinds of political and nationalist identities, and war and a terrible violence. And you get decades and decades and decades of real horror around religion. And what that didn't do was eventually people sort of gave up on the bad stuff and said, oh, we're not going to kill anymore in the name of religion. They did say that. They said, we don't want to kill anymore in the name of religion. And we're going to go and join some really nice peace church instead. No, they dropped out. And we get the development of agnosticism and atheism as a direct intellectual and philosophical result of the wars of religion. So I took that historical idea and I applied it to what was going on with American evangelicalism in the early 21st century and wrote that blog. that bad religion, bad evangelicalism was not going to lead to better evangelicalism and better kinds of churches, but instead it was going to hasten the rejection of Christianity in particular, but religion in general, all the more. And I remember writing in that piece, we could fully expect that there'll be a lot more atheists on the other end of the religious right than there will be people filling the pews of nice, sort of liberal Presbyterian churches.
Yeah.
And so that's an example, Tripp, exactly of what you're asking, is that I saw a problem. People were saying it was for God's politics, and God bless Jim Wallace. He's a good friend and has done so much good and amazing stuff in the world. But Jim's thesis was always that if you presented a better kind of evangelicalism, people would go toward that. And I was always arguing with Jim. I didn't think that that was true. I thought that all of the bad evangelicalism, purity culture, toxic stuff, Jerry Falwell, the religious right, that all that was it was not going to drive people to Quaker meetings and progressive evangelical churches. It was going to make people atheists and agnostics. And that's what another point of Bill's was. He says, let's not blame secularization. I think the decline of Christianity in the United States right now can be placed right squarely on the doorstep of 90% of the evangelical churches in this country.
Yeah.
Ooh. All right, Bill.
I absolutely agree with that, from my perspective, and I suspect Diana's too, that becomes evident even daily with each new kinds of controversies and culture wars as well. And I want to take maybe another side of what I heard in your question, Tripp, about what history might indicate in some way or another about how these kinds of dry periods for the church, certain Christians have found a creative way of responding to that. And that would lead me to say, in a great many eras, and I'm generalizing terribly, but we're not all day long. So it seems to me that the way in that Christians had to learn to rethink their identity again and again, and to find ways of making their case in the public square of whatever country they were in, either because the church of their day, the official establishment, had caved on the heart of the gospel, or because people were just worn out by the church and had begun to pull away. And here's one of my classic examples with the Reformation. One of the great gifts of the Roman Catholic Church was the way in which it made the objective idea that God loves us, and that the God of the universe, creator God, created and loves human beings. But then the question became, how does that love find me as an individual? How does the objective idea of God's eternal love become a subjective experience in my heart? And transubstantiation is the absolute genius of that, because through apostolic succession, you come to the altar and you literally take in the flesh and blood of Jesus Christ. Is Christ living in me? Yes, because he came into me, Albert Cleage's word, in a tangibilified way.
He is in your tummy.
Yes, he's right here. Our daughter, who's a person with special needs, very young, when she growing up in a Baptist context, she used to say, "Jesus lives in my heart." You reminded me of this. Sometimes in my tummy, sometimes in my arms. So it was everywhere. And when the Protestants moved away from transubstantiation or real presence, they had to find a way to make that objective, subjective real to individuals. And that's when conversion, the Puritans made a run at this and others picked it up, when personal conversion became normative. Personal conversion in the church was not normative for required of everyone. Great figures like Augustine and St. Francis had it, but it wasn't normative. And then the Puritans come along and say, everybody has to make a choice themselves between grace or non-grace. And that was some Puritans. Then the Baptists made it the norm for how one enters the church. The baptism is not the door to the church. Conversion and personal faith would be, and then you go through baptism. That's a very important change. And they were able, through a variety of awakenings and methodologies, to perpetuate that in some ways until our lifetime. And so part of what we have to ask, and the emerging church movement was a movement to try to answer that question. How can we find a renewed Christianity when the old ways of renewing Christianity in the church and in ourselves aren't working the way they used to? And the emerging church, Brian McLaren's a great friend of this program, was a way in which that effort was made. I think also African Americans, in terms of conversion and religious experience, even before the Pentecostal movement, brought that heart religion into a whole different perspective as well. But now we're at another one of those slow periods, one of those rough times when you can't be sure anybody knows what any of this means, even some of the most regular people in the church. And what kind of movements then do we just sit around and wait on the end to come, or do we find multiple ways, I think, of re-energizing the church at its heart?
Mm-hmm.
Can I just link in something Bill is saying to the questions that I'm seeing in the box? There have been a couple comments about bad versus good religion, and I think this has to do with what Bill's talking about sort of slow periods and decline and all these different sorts of things, because a decline is a decline from something else, and people will often think, oh, well, we're declining from the 1950s when everybody was in church.
Yeah.
But is that really good or bad? I mean, because in the 50s, maybe that wasn't such a great form of religion. And so the decline now is leaving something that's bad. So it's really interesting and very complex questions there. But I would like to suggest that we can talk about something that's bad versus good religion. And it's a little bit like the Supreme Court and pornogaphy. When bad religion presents itself, you know it. And so it's like pornography in that way. And so there's that kind of smell test. And if somebody comes along and says, oh yeah, we have this great religion, and what they're doing is demeaning people, promoting lynching, what have you, that's not good. It's about violence, exclusion, not loving your neighbor as yourself. And so there's sort of very basic things that you can sort of hold up. And if religion doesn't meet at some level the test of its own ideals towards love and justice, it's not good. It's failed in some way, shape, or form. And so what you can say then is good religion is, I think, religion that allows human beings to flourish. Everyone, there are always flawed people in every sort of historical circumstance. And so no one lives their philosophy perfectly. But seeing sort of what I would call less hypocrisy related to religion than what you might have right now. Literally every day, there are terrible stories about leaders and pastors, just public hypocrisy. And so it's good when religion matches its own test. And its test is always love God, Christianity, love God, love your neighbor as yourself, seek justice, mercy, and kindness. And if you can do that at some level, good. If you're not doing that, it's not good. It's it's a lie. It's toxic. It's hypocritical. What have you? And so I think that you can talk about good and bad in this sense, and that we're not just talking about, sort of institutional decline vis-a-vis some, inflated numbers of the mid part of the 20th century. We're actually talking about the public life, the public expression of an old religious tradition and how it's practiced in community. And right now, the people who are doing this well don't have much of a microphone and are feeling very discouraged. So it's a slow period in that sense. And what appears to be the inverse of quiet charity, of love of neighbor, and all that sort of stuff seems to have the upper hand, and it's really disturbing.
Mm-hmm.
Tripp, you have another question for us?
Yeah. Oh, I wasn't going to cut y'all off if y'all are going to talk back and forth, but the one of the conversations that Diana and I have had at a number of our ruining dinner conversations, and then that always sparked my, I wish Bill Leonard was here, is this shift you see in as Christians move out of the dominant center of culture. And I'd love for you to kind of talk about how you see that transition from culture dominance in American religion, which has changed over time, but what part of the church has been dominant in many ways to has shifted. But now there's this turn, whereas like evangelical religion doesn't see itself as dominating culture, that the shift of their focus has moved from cultural power to political power. And that dynamic, that story, something Diana's chronicled on The Cottage, we've talked about before. But as a Baptist historian who spent a lot of time looking at that shift in Baptist life, from the margins with Roger Williams to Carter getting elected and going forward into all the parsing in the SBC, how do you see taking a step back in the historical picture, the various reactions to decentering Christianity and culture, and that turn in some towards seizing political power when they can't dominate the cultural conversation?
Tripp, are you thinking more of what's happening now, or the past, or
I mean, now definitely in the sense that what I found fascinating in Diana's kind of series of writing about it, and it reminded me of conversations we've had, is the rise of evangelicalism as dominant as the state religion of sorts happened when mainline Protestantism, in many ways, especially among a white religion in America, took certain political stances, this kind of thing. You get the rise of evangelicalism, where, especially if you're in the South, like Bill and I growing up, the Southern Baptist Convention is as dominant as the Catholic Church is if you're walking around Rome, and so that shift of owning the culture to how do we get this this very undemocratic, in a sense, form of democracy, where so many of our Congress people and such, the power at the Supreme Court is this giant dynamic of religion seizing political control when it can't compel conscience anymore.
Well, two things, Tripp. One, I think when you talk about religious privileging and you talk about particular denominations, like the main line had that. That's why we call them main line. They were the official Protestant collective from the Revolutionary period really into the 20th century, and so the religious privilege was there, and in many ways, Protestants, evangelical and mainline, didn't have to ask for privilege because it was implicit in the culture. What's changed in this whole post-Christian conversation reflects it. is that privilege is lost. And now you have certain Christian groups insisting that they are persecuted, when what really seems to be the case is they're no longer privileged in the culture. And again, one of the signs of that was that the old ways of entering the church did not draw the same people, whether that was young families who went to church and had their infants baptized, and they nurtured them in the church, and then they quit going, or they were the people who walked the aisle and got, quote, saved at the revival, and then became a part of that. When those methodologies were less viable in the larger culture, then certain people started asking for some kind of re-privileging, and often through government mandate. And what we might call, what we have to watch for now and see happening in our midst, is what could be called an effort of neo-establishmentarian efforts. And there's I think Linda Greenhouse has a story in today's New York Times about the way in which the Supreme Court is, and this is my word, not hers, is helping to, is facilitating something that looks like the neo-establishmentarian action of the church in the culture. And that's what I meant earlier about the panic that many churches feel at that loss of privilege. And I think also the growth, even though there's still a relatively small number, the growth of other religions in the country and of persons who represented those more in the public square than before has it contributed to that threat that certain people see. And that's part of what worries me, particularly when you ask for state privilege, and then you use your theology to fight the culture wars over sexuality, over what we learn in school, over critical race theory, all of that becomes linked somehow in certain religious communities, that many of which are declining, with theology and culture war being knit together.
Hey, Bill, did you see the statistics on the 118th Congress?
Yes.
That was shocking because it's a great example of what you're talking about. I like this term, neo-establishmentarianism, is that the 118th Congress, the new Congress, actually has more Christians in it than any other Congress in the last 20 years. And so for a while, we saw that Congress was beginning to shift to have more people who were from other religious traditions, just a sort of a wider array. But this one, no, it's gone up to almost 90% of the members of Congress are Christians. And what's interesting about that, of course, is the vast majority of that number are people who are associated with evangelicalism and fundamentalism, very sort of persecuted, the idea that Christianity is being persecuted. These are the panicked white Christian nationalists that mostly come from evangelical churches. So so Congress has become less representative of the diversity of a post-Christian America, which to me just looks like a revolution in waiting. When the people who are supposed to represent the views of the people don't in any way, shape, or form, and are instead trying to put into effect an agenda that reasserts and protects their own privilege.
Yeah. And with that, small example that gets at Congress, the persons in the House of Representatives who want to make a rule that Muslims who are elected to that body have to swear on the Bible and not the Quran. That's come up again in this Congress, I think, and that's the kind of establishmentarian issue we're talking about here. I also think that, and just to put this on the table, all of that concern for the decline, the demographic decline of Christianity, has also brought about the way in which certain Christian groups have touted biblical inerrancy in the face of all that. And I'm a little hesitant to get into that issue, but I've just been writing about that out of a particular case in Florida. And the thing that has always worried me about inerrancy as a guide for orthodoxy is Christian history teaches that there are so many groups in the church who have thought they were doing the scripture, but in doing that, they were dismissing the gospel and missing the gospel. And the civil rights movement and slavery, and with it Jim Crow, are classic historical illustrations of that in this country.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that actually comes to mind thinking of that is, Bill, if people heard other conversations, they know that for the last 30 years or so, your family's been a part of historically Black Baptist congregations in worship, and you've told some real beautiful stories with, like, of Stephanie finding a home there, and your daughter that you mentioned earlier, and I wonder if you think of both your time in your home congregation and then visiting other Baptist congregations quite often as a guest speaker that are predominantly white. Do you think there is a bigger difference between those congregations now than there was previously? Thinking back of your whole history in Baptist life, when was there a time that the experience of hearing the gospel proclaimed and celebrated, and the questions and energy of the faith seem really distinct now? But thinking back to that, your own personal history, in what ways is today similar or different than the past?
We have, since 1992, we've been a member of two predominantly African-American congregations, one in Birmingham and one here in Winston-Salem. And before that, our family, we were nurtured in the Southern Baptist Convention, and then it was time to leave. But and I have to say, I'm still a learner in a predominantly African-American congregation, and am honored to be a part of First Baptist Church Highland Avenue here in Winston-Salem, and even preach from time to time there. And what I think it remains, and I think everybody knows this probably who's listening, the difference, it seemed, the radical difference in white Baptist churches and Black Baptist churches is that the Black Baptist churches, for the most part, the ones I've experienced at least and read about, were the ones who linked religious experience with justice. And I'll tell this quick story. Reverend Dr. Ronald Bobo, who's one of the first Black students I taught in Louisville, said to me one time, you know, you white people talk about heaven with streets of gold and gates of pearl and singing hallelujah and all that. And that's fine. But Black folks also want to know, when we get to heaven, will there be any justice in all this? And can God put right the injustice that so many of us have experienced? And that story stays in me, because that was a major difference. You could use the term evangelical or conversionist to talk about the similarities, but then when you got to issues of justice and reconciliation and compassion, things could change. And that's been a great teacher for me in this. And but what we're seeing now is the black church and the white church are experiencing similar declines. And the black church may be in statistically a little slower movement, but it is coming. I'll tell one more story. We were doing renovation at our church, and we had a meeting to talk about how we were going to spend the money to renovate. And one of the long-term deacons got up and said, well, I don't think we need to redo the Sunday school rooms. And this is a quote, because ain't nobody coming to Sunday school much anymore. And that just cut right through some of the realities we're talking about right now. But those are differences that since you asked, that I'd talk about.
You both kind of in describing the post-Christian century have noted how a lot of our ongoing assumptions about what works, about expectations, even how you judge success is so determined by the glory days of American Protestantism. And and yet what's normative for church history hasn't always been that Christianity is close to power, and that the coming into the faith, learning its story, its rituals, its rhythms, and such is is something you should just get by osmosis through your public school and popular culture. As historians, do you think there's a way that this decentering of the church in American culture, a church that doesn't assume it has access to the throne and the White House and such?
Diana?
I'm here, but we lost Tripp. Sometimes he comes back in.
We did.
Yeah. Well, I think that probably we could go ahead and just keep going, and he'll probably pop back in. Because I think that we're also still being recorded. So he was I think the way that he was sort of shooting that question was to ask us the question, what does a Christianity look like that would be different moving ahead, and do we have kind of examples of that in the past? And as soon as he started talking about that, there was this one comment that he made that just sort of really hit my my imagination very strongly, and that was, he said, certainly examples when Christianity wasn't just attached to power and nationalism. And I thought to myself, I'm having trouble wrestling up some of those examples, because when it comes to thinking about Western Christianity, it almost always winds up being a story that's somehow complicit with nationalism and with politics.
Yes. Yeah. And you use the N word now for nationalism, and one of the great topics that stays with us these days is this rise. I don't know that it's a rise, but it seems like it, in Christian nationalism, and persons who want to define Christianity as the central religion of the country. A few years ago, we had two state representatives here who wanted to be able to define their counties as Christian counties. And the legislature didn't allow it, but that was their concern. That's been a case study for me about how deep all that is. And you find this happening at every turn in the public square. And I don't know if it's not going away anytime soon.
Yeah, I was just thinking about sort of the overall trajectory in the history of Western Christianity. When we think about 500 years ago, the idea was if you were German, you were a Lutheran or a Catholic.
Yes, exactly.
If you were Dutch, you were Reformed. If you were from the nation that becomes Belgium, you're going to be Catholic. And so Europe was divided up according to language and sort of ethnic group and nationalities, along with those religious lines.
Mhm.
And that's one of the things that broke down with the development of constitutional states rather than ethnic states. So the United States or modern Great Britain or different kinds of states that came into being began to do that separation work between civic identity, nation identity, and religion. So that was a big change, and power shifted. Power became less formal rather
Mhm.
than it being in a state church or what have you. And so the it seems almost like what you're saying, and I've really puzzled about this, is we're not really in a nationalist phase. We're in a neo-nationalist
Yes,
phase
yes.
where people want to redraw the boundaries of nations or and religions around ethnicity, I think.
Mhm.
And that was something we had a long time ago. We went through a big period of time when we said, no, we're going to live differently. We're going to try freedom of religion. We're going to try a diverse society. We're going to try to make national identity about something else, not about religion, not about skin color, not about
Yeah.
ethnic, or not about language. Um, has that experiment failed? What do you think?
Uh, it it's dangerously near doing that, and you make me think. That was one of the hopes of American religious pluralism. Will Herberg's Protestant Catholic Jew, uh, from mid 20th century, was a way of talking. Herberg going to talk about the melting pot, that where religious liberty meant not just for certain types of Christianity, but for a whole variety of persons who came. And uh, and you also make me think. I go back again and again to the founders of the colony of Rhode Island, Roger Williams, of course, and then others with him who had this idea in the 17th century that God alone was judge of conscience, and neither the state nor its official church could judge the conscience of the heretic, the people who believe the wrong stuff, or the atheist, the people who don't believe at all. But and they were they were hoping, I think, that people would be converted to Christianity, but they were not going to enforce that. And both of them and others, John Leland a century later, and John Woolman, the Quaker, who helped the Quakers manumit slaves, shamed them into manumitting slaves before anybody else, any other group. They were very concerned in a way that the rest of their culture was not. How did they? I keep asking this. How did they see what nobody around them saw? Williams says he founded Providence Plantation, which he bought from the Native Americans, the land, as that it might be a shelter for persons distressed of conscience. And then he continues, I communicated my said purchase to loving friends who desired to take shelter here with me. And I think that whole issue of freedom and freedom of culture, of conscience, did I say culture? It's freedom of conscience, was a powerful, and I can't get over the insights that they had that people around them didn't see. And really they lay the foundation for what we call pluralism in ways they didn't imagine. And now we're moving back toward another kind of, and saying America as Christian nation is exactly the whole point you were making about Lutherans in certain parts of Europe and Anglicans in other places, and Roman Catholics and others. So finding a way, I think one of the fights we have to have is this issue of freedom of conscience, uncoerced faith, and religious pluralism. William says, we all know that Jews and Turks, their word for Muslims, can be good neighbors like everybody else, and we ought to treat them that way.
Yeah.
And they us.
Yeah, this is to me the big historical puzzle, and a place where it's hard, I think, even for people like you and I are trained in all of this, because I think that Woolman and Williams and Ann Hutchison and other voices
Yes.
of conscience, Joanna Lee, I can think of all kinds of amazing people from that same period. They were flowing toward what the future was becoming.
Yes.
And that a bigger table of society, wider scope of freedoms, and so much of Western history was pressing in that direction. Right now, what it seems like is we have this cross tide where some of European history was pressing toward an even bigger table of conscience and freedom, while the counter tide got stronger.
Yeah.
And so what I see in the counter tide, and Tripp and I have talked about this a couple of times, is just what you described there of the realignment of religion with national identity, ethnicity, etc. That's exactly what Steve Bannon is trying to
Yes.
forward in his show.
Yes.
He talks about that every single day to millions of people who want to realign the planet's political boundaries on the basis of ethnicity and religion. And that is really what's happening in Ukraine. And why it's so hard, I think, for so many more secular journalists to kind of completely get their brains around what's happening there, is that the war in Ukraine is the most dramatic and violent form of the counter tide that we have right now. Trying to bring a nation that wanted to move towards pluralism, Ukraine, trying to move towards democratic pluralism and freedom of conscience, trying to take that nation and say, no, you are Russian. You are our sphere of influence.
Yeah.
You are going to be Russian Orthodox. And that's political and religious belief. We don't care what you personally believe. This is what we're going to make it. You're going to be forced to do this. And so while tides of history sometimes run like that, so that Williams and Joanna Lee look like prophets,
It's gone.
other times you've got this clash of currents, and I don't know which way this is going to flow in or out. And we have tons of people who are getting hurt. We have families that are divided. We have lack of clarity of vision. I mean, just the level of anxiety, I think, is really high because of the fact that we can't tell which way history is potentially moving.
Yes, and when you talk about that conflict, you bring up another issue that I think we have to put into this. All of this is happening in a nation that is armed to the teeth. And one of the great failures, I think, of religious groups in the country is to is not somehow not being able to or even participate, not being able to stop the arming of America or even participate or actually participating in it. And I think one of the things that churches and other religious communities and all the nones have to start asking is, how do we work together to try to stop at least some of the killing? And I'm just very I saw one of the women who've been active since her child was shot in a school starting out her conversation online by saying, "We don't have to die like this." And this life and death issue is just off the charts because of the arming of the nation. So that really means the culture war increasingly really is a war. And churches and other faith communities are working on this. I don't mean to say that we're not, but what I worry is it's gotten so far off the charts that it's going to take a long time to get it back, if at all possible. And so the militant nature and certain kinds of Christianity that are saying, I've been reading recently about this, what's it called? The New Apostolic Reformation that is aiming at promoting dominance of the 7 cultural issues in the country. It's called the 7 Mountain Approach. And it's a formal kind of establishmentarianism, but it's not separated often from for the need for violence. And I think that's complicating everything.
Yeah. So when I think of the way, so often in the past, when we've gotten in American religion to times of tension, there's been movements that expand the centered identity in America, from Protestants to including Catholics to Judeo-Christian to monotheism. You get the movements of the ecumenical movement and the National Council of Churches and the World Council of Churches. There's been these times where anxiety, tensions, difference come up, and the religious traditions go, we need to draw a broader tent. And this kind of expansive shared identity gives us a way to work for blessing our communities and our neighbors out of the richness of the tradition. And one of the things that comes up when religious identity becomes downhill or downstream from politics, and when it leads to a political option and a religious option for people that sees other citizens and other members of Christ's body as deficient and problematic and as enemies, then it's hard to have a grounding in a community, to have an identity as a people of faith, because your external conversation is so driven by going, no, we're not like that. That's not what we're doing. Like, that's not that Marjorie Taylor Greene is not an example of our faith. And you look at the diversity and things that are there, then it becomes this constant parsing. And then what can we share? So when you think of the increasing pluralism of the American religious and spiritual landscape, and the antagonism towards a growing part of the American church, what is a kind of life-giving and affirming of diversity and pluralism way of understanding our Christian identity and in this post-Christian century? Do you have thoughts on how we should think through that question of identity?
There's something that Bill said early on that is a question that came up for me during a lot of my work in the late aughts and the early teens, and that's when I was most on the ground with mainline congregations, groups of mainline Protestant ministers, and they were feeling this sense of, oh my gosh, Christianity is changing. We don't know what we're going to do. And the soccer question came up constantly. The question,
Really?
yeah, really, their privilege. And, people would say, well, there's so many things that now compete with Sunday worship. And they wanted Sunday to be sort of, reserved for them. So there was a no competition zone. And soccer always came up. And I had an answer where that I repeated a lot. And I said, well, are there Jews in America? And people say, yeah, there's, my neighbors are Jewish, my daughter-in-law is Jewish, whatever. I said, there's been soccer on Saturday forever. So how are there Jews in America if there's soccer on Saturday? And people will go, well, that's different. And my comment was then to folks in a kind of a joking and interesting way. I said the truth of it is that Christians need to think like Jews. And the point was there is meaningful religious identity, meaningful communal identity, meaningful worship, meaningful attachment to history, meaningful spiritual practices, meaningful ways to raise your children without having the state take soccer leagues off of Saturday. And if it's true for Jews, and it's true for Muslims with Friday, and it's true for other groups who have different holy days, it's going to be true for Christians as well. And so that means start concentrating on the real stuff that make up family and identity and community, and stop just panicking like a bunch of crazy people because the government it won't come in and protect your sacred space from you. I mean, we won't see church taxation anytime soon, but things might have been heading there for a while. If we ever did, people would go absolutely nuts. Oh, you can't tax the churches. Well, we tax all kinds of buildings and social services and all kinds of stuff. And all those things survive and thrive and do what they're supposed to do. But just try to learn to think without status, without this status
Yes.
of privilege.
Absolutely. That's really very helpful. And the only thing I would add is I'm very encouraged and energized by faith communities in general, and and in my case, Christian communities in particular, who have decided that they no longer have to wait on people to come to them, but they are finding ways to reach out to their communities. And I've called this in other contexts, that these communities of faith are developing signature ministries, is what I would call it. That is, and they may be able only to do one kind of thing in the community. They may be small, but deciding what a need is, and then acting on that outside the doors to the point that people, if they know nothing else about the church, they know, oh, that's the church that does X in the community, that has a tutoring program, or that brings food to a particular group of people, and that part of this renewal, or you were asking about, as I heard you, Tripp, is for churches to realize the old thing of, well, when married couples start having kids, they may have dropped out of church in college. When they start having kids, they'll come back to church. Well, they're not. And so going where they are and to raise these issues. One of my good friends, who's a pastor of a church in Greensboro, just got elected to the school board there. And I told him he's one of the bravest people I now know, because that's such a dangerous thing. But this has been the case with people doing community engagement. But I think a greater intentionality about it both energizes the church. And I've often said, when you start talking about the identity of a church, don't start by asking, are you growing? Ask, are you thriving? meaning is something about your faith position and your sense of community being energized in a way that pushes you to act and live outside the old norms. And then maybe your church will grow, but that's not where you start.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a fear I want to throw at you, and then I have a final question after that. But one of the things that's been at the heart of American religion, and y'all touched on it, is that unlike a large part of the West, we've had a sort of we generated a kind of entrepreneurial space for religion and spirituality in America. And all sorts of different expressions have thrived at different places and parts and cultures and throughout our history. And underneath it has been this kind of dance in preserving the liberty and freedom of individuals' conscience. And that has led to having public debates around topics where you're wrestling, be it moral or, say, history, these kinds of things. One of my fears and I may not even have figured out the best way of asking it yet, is that what do we do in prizing and centering the liberty of an individual's conscience when our desires that get actualized, that we know psychologically lead our rationality around so often, when those desires are being algorithmically shaped? Not just in advertising, but even what gets featured. When the public square is not something where the contesting of truth is framed, where things like, say, reason or facts function, or where the privileged people of a tradition even try to articulate its boundaries, right? Like, part of what is happening even in evangelical spaces are leaders losing their biscuits when TV preachers get put at the center of American religion, and Paula White's running around with the president. And so for so long, there's been a means that the public square and public conversation has been a leveling point. But now, because of our technology, and it even increased so in lockdown, our relationships are mediated by algorithms that shape our desire. How do we rethink through the task of religion, spirituality, when it's hard to assume the truth wins when you let the conscience wrestle with it all?
Just today, I was listening to a reporter interview some people who had gone to the Trump rally, I think it was, in South Carolina. And people were talking about things like, Jewish space lasers and the fact that Biden wasn't really the president of the United States because he didn't have the seal of the president of the United States. And the reporter looked at this woman when she said that, and he said, well, but what about when Biden stands in the White House and talks behind a platform? There's a seal of the president of the United States right there. And she goes, oh no, that's fake. and I literally just looked at that and I went, I mean, that's an example of exactly what you're talking about. It's a person who has been algorithmically looped into a community of discourse that has no bearing on any kind of reality at all. And so the problem that you present, I think, goes back to, in effect, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was, and I actually really love a lot what Jefferson said about religion. I think he was really brilliant. He was a hypocrite in so many ways, and then he saw some other things so crystal clear it wasn't even funny. But is that Jefferson actually believed that in a pluralistic or diverse society where you didn't have one religious tradition, there was no compulsion of conscience and all that sort of stuff, is that the wrestling was just part of it. That was how we would in effect, learn to live with one another and embrace what we could imagine to be the greater common good for this project called America. And so in some of his work around that, he literally talked about how there would be these fights, and that's completely to be expected. But then he said the most interesting thing. He said it's in the argument that truth will out. So that in a democratic society, in a pluralistic society, you always expect argument. You always expect wrestling. You always expect difference. You expect the tensions. You know that there are going to be these clashes. But then Jefferson went the extra sort of enlightenment step and said, truth will out. And see, that's what we've lost. That was what was on MSNBC today, is because something is willing out. But is it anything that is even recognizable as truth? And so that's kind of the underlying, I think, to use a nice big fun fancy word, underlying epistemological problem that's floating around in history right now, is that when we're trying to talk about history and we're trying to explain what's going on now or how we got to this particular place, the loss of any kind of epistemological reality, how we know what we know, historians have no clue how to even talk about that, because we're people who actually depend upon evidence and sort of truthfulness, and we recognize bias. We recognize all kinds of things that come into the telling of the human story. But we also are people who sort of fundamentally think that some stuff really happened, um, and that some stuff is going to happen in the future, and that stuff is somehow related to a thing we've called reality. And now we have whole communities that are just completely disconnected from reality, or who have established a reality that is so out of touch with what we understand to be truth, we don't even know how to talk to each other anymore. So I don't know what will out. I want to go and I want to get Thomas Jefferson out of his grave down there in Monticello and say, Tom, help me here. I don't know how to revise your statement.
Those are great points. And you mentioned the essentially the online nature of ideas at this point. And it seems to me that's where traditional religious communities are struggling, and where there's a profit for every form of truth that Diana was laying out. And so another piece of this that we haven't talked about is this tension between community and individualism. And individualism has become so dramatically essential in American life that it really is what the Catholics said about the Reformation. Everyone is her own priest. And that doesn't necessarily mean in traditional religion. It means priest about ideologies. And for every church that's streaming their services on Sunday, there are thousands of 24/7 prophets online talking about the apocalypse or creating an apocalypse or all kinds of ideas. And when Diana was talking about, when you were talking about finding truth, that's really at the heart of where things are. And the election denial is simply one terrible but singular illustration of a pluralism of truths, or a denial of truth altogether in the culture. And that's one of the greatest challenges, I think, the whole country faces. but that faith communities are particularly vulnerable about. And so you gather, speaking from a Christian perspective, your congregation gathers once or twice a week around a particular set of ideas, but you don't know how much, 12 hours a day, 14 hours a day, that is being either contradicted or displaced or individualized in the homes of the people who come together for 1 hour of worship a week.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know we're about done, so I want to ask you one last question, Bill, because Diana and I are going to spend Lent looking at attempting to recover some saints from American church history. And part of it is really recognizing that knowing your story and being able to tell it is the most powerful way humans have learned to cooperate as a species. From the origins of language and symbolic communication on, stories bind us and give us identity, and out of that comes a deep reservoir of resources and values. And recognizing the task before us to rediscover and re-narrate our story as Americans in light of so much of our past, and as Christians, detoxing from Christendom and imperial infatuation. When you think of American religious history, something you've spent your career teaching, who are there a couple figures that if you said to yourself, oh man, if we were going to pick someone and their narrative as one to feature, there's no good list of American saints for our present moment if these people aren't on it?
Probably like you and Diana, my list changes constantly. but listening to you, I'll tell you one I would start with, because it's somebody, and that's a great question because I've gone back to her this week over some issues, and that's Fannie Lou Hamer.
Oh,
and I may tear up talking about it. Mississippi, civil rights activist, but in the heart of her activity for civil rights, quote unquote, is really the heart of her activity for humanness. And there's that great story when she got some people on the bus to take them to register to vote, and a cop pulled the bus over, and they wouldn't let them register when they got there. And then I think they're coming back from that effort, and cops pulled them over and got them all off and did all that. And everybody's frustrated and everybody's disappointed. And in the middle of that, Fannie Lou Hamer stands up in the back of the bus and starts singing "This Little Light of Mine." And the people who teach us to do that in the midst of the worst kind of setting. And she got arrested, and this is a thing to say, particularly today at Mr. Nichols' funeral. The white cops made a black prisoner beat her in jail. So she lays all that on the line as a person of faith, but beyond the church doors. And so she's one of the people that I keep coming back to. And I'd run a whole list like Thomas Merton and all of those people that we all know. But Fannie Lou Hamer would be one person for me.
Bill, you are in
Awesome.
such good company, because earlier this week I had Otis Moss on my little show that I do through the cottage, and he mentioned her too.
Really?
Yeah, and he specifically mentioned that same event in relationship to what just happened in Memphis,
Yes.
about how the white police got the black prisoner to beat her up. And
Mhm.
Otis said that as that was happening, she actually forgave him. She
Wow.
and so, oh, I mean, as Otis was telling the story, he was talking about how white supremacy gets in the bodies of Black people,
Yes.
and it was just it was so moving. I was almost brought to tears when
Mhm.
with Otis sharing that.
Yeah. Yeah. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Mm.
Well, this has been a blast. I've really enjoyed it, and glad when the power went off and on in our house, y'all didn't disappear.
Oh,
I freaked out, and I'm like, oh my goodness, everything just went off. Now the internet's off, and I just like, wow, I'm talking, and their faces are perfectly still. I'm glad it didn't mess it up or distract, because this was a beautiful and fun conversation, and hopefully we'll be able to lure you two into talking again sooner than later. But complete blast, everyone. I will put links. Well, if you're on the live stream, there's a link to the Intro to Church History book Bill did for the Homebrewed Christianity book series, and the one looking at the history of religious experience in America, which is my favorite of Bill's books.
Tripp, can I mention
yeah.
one thing? Don
Yeah.
Manning Miller has just written to us that he had the pleasure of knowing Mrs. Hamer.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So I'll put the links to stuff in there, and all of you are invited to join us this Lent. Go to emptyaltars.com, and when you join and pop in, if you go into the Facebook group, but it's not required, we're going to set up a post where people can name the what is the American saint that whose story and their fidelity you think is one worth preserving and telling to those that come next. So we're very excited to do this. Diana, you have any final thoughts? I just kind of am smitten listening to my nerdy friends talk.
No, I'm just thinking how wonderful it is to see Bill.
Yes,
He
me too.
was already teaching. He was already a professor when I was in graduate school all those years ago. So I hate to remind him that he's actually older than me. But I just want to say that his kindness and intelligence, an incredible model, and one of the reasons why I actually love my field. For some reason not entirely known to me, church history tends to attract really gracious, thoughtful, and caring people, and he is just a model of that. And I thank you, Bill, for all the support and care and encouragement and challenge and all the wonderful gifts that you've given me over the years. First, when I was a graduate student, and then as I got lucky enough to grow into a colleague, and we both got run out of our respective institutions.
We did. A quick thank and great joy to be with both of you. And Diana, I started to say at the beginning, I won't say that Diana and I have been friends a long time, but our friendship started shortly after the Magi found the baby Jesus. It's that long a friendship, and I read you constantly and get your emails about it. And it's great fun to be with both of you. And Tripp is just a trip. We all know that. So.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining. I'll look forward to seeing you all, both of you again, but everyone that's joined the live stream and listen later. And if you joined halfway through, remember, you can start the video up or check the podcast tomorrow, and it will be there. So we will see you all later.